Good morning. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Crystal, who I originally spoke with. I'm really happy for this opportunity to be with ISM Charlotte and a few other chosen areas around the country. So this is a crazy time, but it's really a nice aspect of this that we can be with people all over the world without long plane flights, and we can have people calling in from all over the country. I know I'm in California. We have someone from Colorado on, and I know this is for ISM Charlotte. So in that area, there's a lot of other people. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So I'm just going to get started today, and I'm going to start this with Murphy's Law. I have an Irish heritage, but Murphy's Law, I think maybe everyone's familiar with this. It's a pretty common example, this one. There's longer versions, but nothing is as easy as it looks. Everything takes longer than you expect, and if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong, and at the worst possible moment. So we live in a high risk time frame. I thought these were kind of apropos. We can probably all relate to one or more of these managerial philosophies. They're not exactly risk-based, even though one of those is entitled The Essentials of Risk Management. And another one declares that, yes, they were fully aware of the risks. So the strategy they employed is to figure out where to point the finger at the blame at the end when there's a problem. And then finally, the one on the bottom, this one I know I resonated with a lot when I was in corporate America, when I'm struggling along, and this, sorry for the resolution here, struggling along, pulling a cart full of rocks, and someone offers me wheels, and I say, no, 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 we're too busy. We don't have time to stop and make improvements. We just have to keep going. So if this resembles your workplace, then you're in a good place today. We're going to talk about risk-based thinking and how to incorporate that into risk-based decision-making for supply chains. So I'm going to ask 3 questions. And I would like you to put into the chat room if you have the answer yes to any of these questions. So for example, I'm going to give you these 3 questions. If you answer 1 and 3 yes, then just put 1 and 3 into the chat room. That'll make it real quick and easy. So the first question is, do you know the 2 dimensions of risk, and do you incorporate those into all or most of your decisions? Number 2, does your organization track identified risk occurrences along with the rate of incidents and the impacts to those? And number 3 is, are you confident on how to bring risk-based thinking into your organization? So if you can just take a second now and put into the chat room any of those yeses. So just put the number 1, 2, or 3 if you answer yes to those. I see a couple people participating. Thank you. So I see a lot of yeses on question number 2, not so much some of the others, which is fine. So we're going to talk about some of those today. We're going to look at first a definition of VUCA. This may be a term that you've heard before. It may be one you're not familiar with, but if so, I'm going to introduce it. And if you've heard of it, we're going to talk a little bit about how that applies today. And we'll look at some definitions of risk and how that forms in the workplace. We'll talk about 5 domains of decision making. We'll look at 4 different types of decision making that you can incorporate into what you're working on now and in the future. We'll look at 3 different factors that can really help to reduce the impacts of risk or not. And then I'm going to do a raffle, and we're going to give away some prizes. So we have a lot to cover today. So I want to stay connected with everyone who has decided to participate today. And to be part of the raffle, I'm going to ask you right now to send me an email. Send it to Jane at purplelink.co. No M, just .co. And put in the subject line webinar. If you do this, you're going to get into the prize drawing. And you're going to have to be here at the end to confirm that you're here. So you have to stick around. So if you do this, you're going to get some ongoing resources, including the slides from today's presentation, and you might get a chance to win the prize at the end. If you're not quite ready right now, it's okay. I'll give you another chance at the end before I make the drawing. But if you're so inclined, go ahead, send me that email and put subject in the subject line, put just the word webinar. Nothing else on the email is necessary. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. The reason we're talking about risk today is because we have a climate and environment in supply chain professionals that really is feeling a lot of risks and a lot of impacts from those risks that has manifested over the last few months. A lot of people and a lot of organizations got a rather rude awakening in the March and April timeframe as they found gaps in their supply chain and they found challenges that they didn't really know were lurking there. So my background is an industrial engineer, and the part of my career that I spent the first part of my career is as a manufacturing engineer in aerospace. So I'm a little bit of a factory geek. I really never turned down a factory tour, and if you don't believe me, you can ask my husband, who's been dragged through all kinds of interesting places over the years. But quality and efficiency, productivity, those are in my foundation. So I'm very process oriented. I value consistency. And I worked as a manufacturing engineer for 10 years with a company, that aerospace company. I thought I would probably retire there. But all of a sudden they announced that they were shutting down. And myself and almost 10,000 other people suddenly were looking for jobs. So as luck or fate would have it, I completed my MBA about the same time, within a couple of months of the plant shutdown. So I was really open to something different. I just finished my MBA because I knew that I needed extra skills. I'd gotten into management and I knew I needed to do more than just rely on my engineering background and my experience. So I looked around, found a job, and where I found that job was with Hewlett Packard, but it was in procurement. I knew really nothing about procurement, but they needed somebody that knew, that had manufacturing experience and who could lead projects, and I really was good at both of those. So I joined that team. It was good company, good people that I worked with, but it took me almost a year to admit that I worked in procurement. So after that initial kind of reluctant dragging into that area, I found that I really liked procurement and I embraced it. I enjoyed doing the travel to visit the different suppliers. I've been fortunate to go around the world and see lots of different places, work with some incredible people. I've learned about a lot of different manufacturing processes that I couldn't have learned working with a very vertically integrated company. I've worked out a lot of deals for my company, and I like to use collaboration and win-win outcomes. And I find that often I can get better results than with traditional negotiation methods that some of my colleagues use and espouse and prefer. So I used my early manufacturing experiences to show me the correlation between risk and cost. As a manufacturing engineer, I knew some of that. But working in procurement really opened my eyes to a lot of different kinds of risks that businesses encounter. So I really wanted to do my job and progress in my career, and I also wanted to help my company. So I worked out a few ways to address the risk and the cost, and managing the risk I found reduced the cost. So that today is my passion. I founded my company to help clients prosper and include suppliers in finding the dollars that are leaking through their supply chain and drain the bottom line. It's not all about experience. It's not all about education. It's really combining concepts and applying those to the real world. So we're going to start today by examining some risk theories and philosophies, and then talk about how they can be applied in the workplace. I suspect you're here today because risk is an important topic to you and your company. It is to many companies around the world and their employees. This list has a few different examples of common risks that companies are facing today and that they're dealing with. So there's a lot of different things that you might have encountered during this pandemic, and even before that. Health and safety have been risks for years. We've been dealing with disasters. There's more hurricanes. I was in a hurricane in Louisiana a few years ago, about 3-4 years ago, when a hurricane struck. I was like, it actually missed most of where I was, and it wasn't that devastating, but we've seen some very devastating ones. I grew up in the Midwest, and we have tornadoes. And actually, couple years after I graduated, a tornado hit the high school that I had gone to, and my brother actually happened to be in that high school at the time. So he was fine, but the high school took quite a beating. So we deal with these things in a lot of different areas. We've seen suppliers and customers and companies be challenged financially with this COVID, but they were challenged before with different economic conditions. Regulatory and legal challenges have always been there, and they will continue to be there. We're seeing more and more compliance issues in supply chains today than ever before. Ethics is a huge area of focus for procurement and supply chain professionals, and we're always working with information, proprietary, confidential, intellectual property. We're trying to make sure that we protect that of our suppliers and of our company. So the pandemic has sent a lot of shockwaves through supply chains. And as we in Southern California really know well, large quakes are often followed by aftershocks. And we're going to see aftershocks from this pandemic for quite a while, I think. As we move through the pandemic into either the phase two, the recovery, however you want to classify that and describe that in your part of the country, in your area, in your industry, companies are looking at their supply chains more closely than ever before. We're looking to close the gaps, and we're looking at the gaps that the pandemic exposed, the ones that we knew that were there before, and now we're looking even closer to see what else might be lurking in there. So we're going to look into what we can do as we move into whatever this thing we're calling the new normal, and how we're going to be able to navigate those waters. So you might have heard this acronym, VUCA. Its usage has really increased in the last few months. It covers the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that we find ourselves in. It didn't come from the pandemic, but it sure is picking up a lot of steam and resonating now with people more than ever. This term originated about 1986 in actually the U.S. Army War College. It characterized a turbulence in strategic leadership positions. So it was coined at that point, and a famed military theorist, Karl von Clausewitz, is the one that actually coined this term. So we're seeing a lot of these things. The volatility, the pace of change is crazy. Uncertainty, we all have a lot of uncertainty, especially with the combination of what we have today. We have the pandemic, we have a lot of social unrest, we have an election coming up, we have a lot of different things going on, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to be there for us next month, next quarter, into 2021. And heaven knows we're more complex than ever with the numbers of industries, the markets. We've said for years, the world is a smaller place. We have a lot more global supply chains, a lot more interacted and interconnected supply chains, and a lot more forces working on us. So we've got a lot of things going on there. And ambiguity, yeah, we've got not just the fog of war that they started with when they coined this, but we've got a lot of things going on that can be viewed in a lot of different perspectives. If you need more evidence than that of the political perspectives, I don't know how much farther you need to go. People look at the data, people look at information, people look at different things on social media, on the news, in the internet, read the paper, but the conclusions they draw are not all the same. So everything is very, very sketchy at this point. There's a lot of different ways we can go. It's a VUCA environment. So when we try to make decisions, when we look for how to make risk-based decisions in the workplace, one of the things we have to consider is the appetite for risk that we have, risk and risk tolerance. So the appetite really is how much risk can you tolerate in this certain situation. Every person and every organization has a certain appetite for risk. Some people are risk takers. We know those people. They fly down the street, or I like to snow ski. We see the people on skis and snowboards just flying down the mountain. That's not me. Not only because I can't do that, but because I'm not that much of a risk taker. We have neighbors next door. The boys like skateboards. So they're up and down on those skateboards at the skate park doing all kinds of crazy things. We see people, motorcycles, cars, boats, whatever that is, mountain climbers. There's a lot of people that have that inherent risk-taking attitude. Others are by the book. They follow the speed limit very strictly. They pay attention to all the caution flags, and anytime it says you're not supposed to, they don't do that. And there's a lot of people in between, and that's fine. And organizations are the same way. Some companies, often tech companies, have the ability and the willingness to make heavy investments in new products, new software, new features, new technologies, trying to get a competitive edge or to capture or even create a market. Other companies are more traditional, more bureaucratic, and more risk averse. They follow processes. They want to make sure that things are known before they move forward. Neither one is right or wrong, but this continuum exists, and we need to understand where we are and where the organization is and what their appetite for risk is before we really can move forward with making more risk-based decisions. It's important to understand that. Engineering companies, engineering departments too, can be less risk averse or more risk averse than the rest of the organization. So not only does it vary with company to company, person to person, but different functions within a company can vary greatly. You can have suppliers that are more risk tolerant or risk averse than your company is if you're the manufacturing or the transformer company. Same way with customers. They can be more or less risk tolerant than your company. So it's important to assess those things and to understand. Early adopters, the people looking for the bleeding edge technology, those people are the risk takers. Those companies are the risk takers. Other companies are holding back. They want to see they want to make sure that you get the bugs worked out and the things are proofed out and have a little more time to settle in. I know I had an uncle who would never buy a car the first year it was released. He was bound and determined that he wanted new cars pretty frequently, but he would never buy a car the first year it was released. He said there was too many problems with that. So he would wait till the second or third year to buy that model. Even though he looked at some of these models really hard and really wanted some of them, he just refused to do that. We see the same thing with phones. We see the people lined up for the new phones, whether it's Android or iPhone or whatever. They want the latest, they want the greatest, they want the brand new one. And other people are very reluctant to buy the first one out. They want to wait, buy last year's model because they assume everything works better with that. So we're going to look at risk and we're going to look at these assessments. When you assess the risk of a situation, you want to use two different dimensions, which we're going to cover in just a second. But we want to do this whenever we can with a cross-functional team because we want to get different perspectives. We want to do this both internally and externally if we can, looking at both the supplier and the customer's perspective. And because you need support for decisions that you're going to make, it's important to try to use a consensus process to reach the agreement on the assessment, and then you can move forward on what that means. Once you classify that risk and integrate that into your risk-making process, then you can move forward. So you may not have everyone agree completely in a consensus situation, but everyone understands and everyone supports the ultimate assessment. So this is a heat map model. There's two dimensions of risk. And when we think of what might happen, what could possibly go wrong at the worst possible time, back to Murphy's Law, it helps to rate possibilities of what can go wrong and how bad it's going to be on both of these dimensions. So these tell you how likely is this risk to happen, and then what are the consequences if it does happen. I'll give you an example. I live here in Southern California, and we have earthquakes. 100% certainty that earthquakes will happen in the Los Angeles area, say over the next year. We have earthquakes. But the closer you are to a fault line, the more you might feel that earthquake. And a lot of the earthquakes that we experience here over the course of a year are very low on the Richter scale. And thanks to the strict building codes And enforcement of that, we have retrofitting and all of those things. Many homes and businesses can withstand low and even moderate earthquake levels. Even the high-rise buildings, they're built to take certain levels of earthquakes. And many times these earthquakes occur unnoticed. Residents here don't even know they happen until they see it on the internet or the news, or like me, I'm from the Midwest. So oftentimes a relative will call me or email me, text me, and ask me if I'm okay. And I wonder why they're asking. And they say, oh, there was on the news, I saw there was an earthquake. And my mother used to do this. She's not with us anymore, but she would call and say, oh, there was an earthquake today. And I would say, I don't know anything about it. It wasn't anywhere near me. The Los Angeles area is huge, both in people and in geographic area. And so a lot of these aren't felt anywhere in the area. So the probability of the occurrence is high, but the impact most often resulting from that is negligible to minor damage. There is a small chance that we'll have one of the big ones, like the Northridge quake that happened here in 1994. But a lot of our efforts are channeled into mitigating the lower impact, lower Richter scale earthquakes. And we do put some effort into looking at what happens if we have a serious earthquake, a serious fire, a serious other kinds of things. So if we do have crisis level things, we do take precautions for that. But we don't overly fret about a small earthquake that we may or may not feel and that probably isn't going to give us any damage. So these heat maps vary from organization to organization, and you can see in the examples I have here, there's lots of different ones. The one in the center has a 3x3 matrix. It's very simple. It goes from low to medium to high. So likelihood on one, probability on one axis, the other axis, that this says sensitivity, but it's really the impact to that. So in this case, they go as far as the low, 3 boxes with low, 3 boxes with medium, 3 boxes with high. And the pattern of these varies. So you can see of the 4 different examples here, the one in the bottom right has the upper right corner is all red, which is the danger zone. And that would be number 4 and number 5 on both axes. That has a 5x5 matrix. The one in the top right is a 4x4 matrix, and you can see that pattern is a little different. And then the one on the bottom left has the danger area, the red area in the bottom right corner. It's still from high to low, but it has the switch of the red area in the graph. So none of these is right or wrong. You just have to find kind of what works for you. And the scales for ranking these things can be very simple. The simple one in the middle, low, medium, high. You can get more complex with this. You can assign numbers. If you look at the bottom left one, there's some numbers assigned. You don't know how these numbers are figured out, but they are assigned by a team. So these models will evolve with your organization as you become more accustomed to using them. The thing to remember is you want to be consistent so you don't have different maps for every different situation. You want to start and say, what do we want to use? How do we want to do this? How are we going to assess these risks? We're going to look at probability. We're going to look at impact. And these are the areas that we can tolerate. This is where the appetite for risk comes in. This helps you define what area is red, what area is yellow, and what area is green. Typically, these maps are color-coded red, yellow, green, which I know for those of you who are colorblind doesn't help a lot, but you can still see the differences in how you define what is the danger, what is acceptable, and what is okay to proceed, not really a big deal. So you have your heat map that helps you assess the risk. And then when you look at decision making, we have different ways to make decisions. And one of the frameworks that I like to use is in decision making is the Kniffen framework. And if I don't pronounce that right, then I apologize. It's a very unusual word. It's a Welsh word for habitat. And these 5 dimensions are simple, complicated, complex, chaotic, and disorder. We're going to look briefly at each of these. But these take into account more than the probability and potential impact, that they look at what kinds of decisions are made and how that might be incorporated into work. I really like this picture. It's got way too much detail for a slide, and I apologize for that. But it kind of gives you a visual of all the things going on and all the things that you might consider in making decisions, and why decision making is really not a simple thing and isn't a quick and simple process. So the simple domain, this is where decisions that fall into this are really familiar. You've made these kinds of decisions before. You've seen these scenarios. You've seen them play out. You may already have rules and processes for how to proceed given these types of situations. They're not highly volatile environments, and a clear path usually becomes evident pretty quickly. A danger for decisions that are simple decisions is that you can downplay risks, or you may not fully understand the whole situation. If these risks are assessed as a real low probability and low impact, that's great. If they're assessed that way incorrectly, then you can have a lot of problems. So you want to be careful about what you consider in the simple quadrant. Decisions falling into the complicated quadrant require some analysis, and this can be a real hang-up for the decision makers. This is where organizations and individuals know there's a lot of open questions, there's unknowns, and these can result in what we call analysis paralysis. Or in some cases, people or organizations take too long in making a decision. So you miss the opportunity, or the dynamics change and you can make a wrong decision, or you can have another whole decision that needs to be made because the circumstances changed. Good leadership in these situations drives to closure in a timely fashion, and a higher tolerance of risk from the individuals and from the organization helps to make these decisions without complete data, and can result in a timely and positive outcome. So you want to be careful about the complicated ones. Don't get stuck. Decisions falling in the complex domain, they're even a little more difficult, because these are probably areas where you have unfamiliar challenges, new challenges, or problems that are multifaceted. These situations have what we call unknown unknowns. These can wreak havoc down the line because you don't know what you don't know. Decisions here are best assessed after the risk is encountered, and what we say, looking in the rearview mirror. So when it's behind you, then you can see, oh, how did we do with that? That's not always a great situation to be in, because you can't assess it until it's already behind you, till it's part of the history. In this case, teams often want to dissect risks into smaller chunks, and they may take the approach of, let's take it apart and see how it works. What happens is they take it apart and they still can't figure out how it works. So the best path forward in this situation may be very analogous to putting a 1,000 piece puzzle together. You just dump it on the table and you start sorting. You start going through and find pieces that are the edges. Then you find pieces that have similar colors, similar patterns on them, however you want to do that. But there's a lot of different ways to tackle these. But when you've got these unknown unknowns, it's a real challenge. In the chaotic domain, these decisions can result from changing circumstances, from a situation where you've identified a lot of symptoms, but you don't have the root cause. You can be in an emergency situation without a playbook, without any experience in how to move forward. This could be something that's not in your business continuity plan. Maybe you planned for a tornado and all of a sudden you have a fire. So it's a different kind of scenario than you planned for. This is a triage situation. You want to sort the critical from the surface wounds, and you want to channel resources where you can actually make a difference and make a change in something. These situations require really good, strong leadership, and leaders who can make decisions even when you've got a lot of uncertainty. So you have to take what you know and act on that. In this case, action is better than waiting around to see what's next. So doing something is going to move you forward a little bit and help the group move forward. In this case, communication strategies are a real huge help. So even if you can't plan for every scenario, what you do want to plan is, how are we going to communicate if something happens? When I was in the corporate world, I did a lot of business continuity planning and exercises with the senior executives of the company that I was working for, or at least the site that we were working for. And we always talked about that. How do we communicate? Who's in charge of this? Who's going to communicate to this group, to that group, to the other group? I was in the supply chain area, so my job was always, how do we communicate to suppliers? So how do we get the means to communicate that to them? What kinds of things are we going to use? How are we going to get hold of phone numbers, emails, all of these different things? And how can we make sure that people know what's going on in these situations? I lived in the Midwest, and I've lived in Colorado, and one of the communication there is snow or weather. When you have bad weather, how do you communicate to people? Don't come in, do come in late, whatever. Same thing with the school. If you have kids in school, you get those alerts that say no school today, or we're going to have a late start today, or we're going to let people out early because it's hot. So there's all these different things, and the communication strategies become really key into how you deal with that. The disorder domain is the final one. This is really emergency or crisis decision making, but it's really unclear when you do this if any of the other domains can apply or you can make those types of decisions. You don't really have a clear way forward. Stakeholders don't agree on what to do first. The best thing to do here is to break down the situation and see if you can use other techniques or approaches to resolving the situation. You don't want to make sweeping long-term commitments. You want to do some incremental things, and you want to just assess and see how that's moving forward. So when you've got the probability and you've got the impact, you still want to consider what kinds of decisions am I making related to those risks, and how to manage them, how to mitigate them, how to prevent them, how to reduce them. And then there are 4 types of decisions that you can make when you understand that. So covering the 2 dimensions of risk, looking at these domains, now we're going to introduce 4 types of decisions that we call the 4 T's. In the first instance, if there's a risk identified that's high in probability, high in potential impact, the best decision may be to cut your losses and turn back, or T is terminate. If a supplier is in breach of a contract, for example, there's no clear way forward with that supplier, then one decision you make is find another supplier as quickly as you can, settle whatever you can with the vendor that's in breach, and manage this impact by not incurring further pain and digging in deeper. So you just terminate and say, I can't handle this risk. Or I choose not to accept this risk, so we're going to have to find another solution. If the risk has, say, medium probability and medium impact, it's often a good strategy to treat that condition. So you want to put in prevention so you can do things to keep it from occurring. You want to monitor that situation to find ways to reduce the likelihood, or you want to reduce the consequences and the likelihood, if you can do both of those. Early warning signals, early warning signs are usually there, so you can be on the alert for what tells you that this risk may be coming your way, or it may be manifesting. So you want to look at that and figure out what you can do before the risk actually happens to de-escalate the seriousness or the criticality of that. If you have a risk with medium or high probability, but maybe low impact, the best course of action might be to tolerate the risk and just proceed in spite of that. So if it's something that you think you can accept, if it's within your appetite for risk tolerance level, then you just try to reduce the likelihood. You still want to monitor that, but you want to see if you can impact the consequences even further, reduce the impact of the consequences further. And if the reward outweighs the risk, then go ahead and do that. It's something you can tolerate. It's something you can deal with. It's something that isn't going to bring you to your knees if that risk actually happens and appears as a manifestation in your supply chain. And then another strategy in decisions is to share or transfer the impact. So it often goes with medium and high impact risks, and a mitigation or reduction of that impact being expensive or taking a lot of resources or time to address. If that's the situation, if you can bring in other stakeholders, often customers and suppliers also help, then that's a good approach, especially if there's a reward that can be shared by everyone. So terminate if it's not worth the risk, treat it if you can, as much as you can, tolerate it if it's something that's not going to be a huge impact to you and within your tolerance level, and then see how you can share or transfer that risk. Finally, we're going to look at 3 factors that help these risks and help reduce the impacts. The first factor is people. Those that participate in the risk assessments, as well as those that make the decisions and deal with executing the decisions. The ones that craft the mitigation plans, monitor the situations, make sure everything happens. People are really the make or break part of this process. We all have unique backgrounds and experience, and these shape how we look at situations. They shape how we look at life. We have different appetites for risk. Our functional perspectives on the probability and impacts can vary. So if I'm looking at this from a supply chain perspective, I might have one assessment. My colleague in engineering may have another one. My colleague in finance may have a different perspective in what the risk is, both in the probability of that risk and the potential impact. So our views are shaped by our experiences, our training, and the results that we've seen from previous situations where we've taken action. So we've learned or been reminded in the last few months, I'm going to guess here, most of us, that we've dealing with this pandemic and the social unrest and the political climates, we've all been forced to do a lot of things. And I think we can all agree that stress is really not a positive influence on human beings and human behavior when we're trying to make some serious decisions. So if we can de-stress the situation, that's good. We can't always do that. And that is why consensus is really a preferred approach to risk assessment. Trying to get all the participants to discuss the ratings, the rationale, share the data and the sources and the drivers that drove that ranking, that assessment, and come to a mutual conclusion on what the assessment is, the risk assessment is for the organization. You're not going to have everyone completely agree on this, but you can reach a situation where everyone supports the rest of the organization because they understand the different perspectives from the different participants and they respect the conclusion that that team draws on what that risk could do to the company. The second area is information. So I've talked about different states of decision making like analysis paralysis or freezing and not being able to make a decision or making a decision too slowly. When we have situations of both known and unknown unknowns, so sometimes we know what we don't know and other times we don't know what we don't know. And oftentimes we have incomplete information. So today we have more data available than at any time in history, but we still can have incomplete or insufficient or even worse, incorrect information. So both data and information are subject to interpretation, depending on the source or the analysis process. A good example of this is cost savings. Procurement and supply chain departments everywhere track cost savings. Every company I've worked for and all my clients, all the suppliers I've worked for track cost savings in one way, shape, or form. Often the department head reports on this monthly or quarterly to the senior executives, and they talk about the savings that they have found through negotiation, through new suppliers, through 100 other techniques, continuous improvement, any other initiatives they have. They report these in dollars, they report these in percentage cost reduction, they report these against standard cost or last year's cost or. There are many different ways to do this. But rarely have I seen a finance department and a supply chain or procurement department report the same level of savings. There's a lot of reasons for this because procurement doesn't often count cost increases. They look at cost decreases and reductions, and that's what they track. They don't add in all of the increases. Sometimes they don't add in associated indirect costs with things like shipping or the extra carrying costs because they outsourced and now they have the inventory on the books for 5 weeks longer than they did before. So that shows up in finance, but it doesn't necessarily show up in the procurement cost accounting. You can apply cost reductions against a unit cost to a theoretical volume, and it becomes a projection. So we reduced this last month. We reduced it 2%. So that 2% of next year's volumes is equal to $150,000. But finance is reporting historical, and they don't see any cost savings because that really hasn't had time to be processed through the system yet. So these different methods of capturing data, tracking, and reporting end up with different assessments and different inclusions into the reporting system. Neither is wrong, procurement or finance, but they're not measuring the same things in the same way. So you come to different conclusions. When we do this as teams, we need to assess the risk using consistent numbers, consistent processes, and information to the extent possible. And we have to remember that data isn't information. So data is just that. And then it's how we interpret it, how we analyze it, that really makes it into information that we can use to take action with. The final factor is the processes we use to assess, measure, rate, rank, all of the situations, conditions, the risks, and take the actions for that. There's a RACI model, which is responsibility, accountability, consultancy, and informants. It's a good reference model, but those heat maps are also good for risk assessment. But they need to have some consistency in the process, and you need that standardized process to develop and evolve. Again, the first process that you use won't be the one you're using in 2 or 3 years, and that's fine, as long as you do that consistently and bring this into part of the culture as part of your decision making. So the processes you use need to be standardized at first, and then they're going to evolve over time. So what I know for sure is there's a better way to manage risk and reduce cost. And one way to do that is using risk-based thinking and decision-making. The pandemic has been a big kick in the teeth and a wake-up call to many people and many organizations. And some companies are super attuned to how valuable managing the supply chain is to managing the bottom line, more than ever before. I've worked in procurement and supply chain for a long time, and so many times I've had people say, what do you mean supply chain? What do you mean your company works on supply chain? You do supply chain consulting. And I've had a lot of friends and colleagues say, oh, now I get it. So after we had the run on toilet paper and paper towels, a lot of people said, oh, I get it now. I think you know how to, I think I know what you do. So that isn't exactly the case, but people are aware that supply chains are critical to the business success. We need that end-to-end visibility in the supply chain. Risk assessments are dynamic. What is a risk today may not be a risk for many reasons next month, next year, whatever. And what isn't a risk or what's not on our radar screen may suddenly pop up and need to be addressed. So we need to be careful with that over time and make sure that we continually do the risk assessments and update that. This is not a one and done kind of exercise. We need contingency mitigation plans. We need monitoring programs so that we can track those risks. We need to look at internal as well as external stakeholders and include those in the decisions where it's appropriate. We need to look at the environment that we make the decisions in and look for ways to prevent, mitigate, reduce the impacts. We have a lot of indicators around if we are looking and we're aware, so we have to teach our teams to be aware of that and monitor and check those things out. The more flexible we are, the more quickly we can respond, the better we can handle the crisis or the risk, and the more able we are to reduce the impact of whatever risk that is. We really do live in a VUCA world, and it's an area of increasing, expanding risks, lots of different things that we didn't know about, lots of changing ways to look at the business. So what's next? Now you know the basics. And I realize that this risk-based thinking is not easy to implement. It's not easy to communicate. It's not easy to bring into an organization. In person, I usually ask for your thoughts on what I've shared, but it's harder to do that with a Zoom meeting. So I'm going to ask you to either put into the chat or maybe just write down for yourself one thing that you think you can take away from this presentation and take back to your organization. And if you'd like to share that with me, I'd greatly appreciate it, because I like to know what resonates with people. If you've had an aha thing, if you'd like to share that with the rest of the organization, that's great. And I know that if you're like me, you attend some of these talks and you get excited and you get inspired. But after this is over, if you haven't already eaten lunch, you might eat lunch, or you may be eating lunch at the same time. But once you get back into your office, or maybe into office mode, if you're not into an actual office, back to your work from home office, you forget, you get distracted. There's a disruption comes up, as it always does in supply chain operations. You get distracted by something. There's another question, there's another query, there's another problem to solve. And sometimes you try to implement ideas, but others don't fully grasp those. They haven't been to this talk, they don't understand. And all of these things can be frustrating. So we're going to look at what you can do. If you need help in identifying the risk mitigation plan, developing, bringing this into your organization, then I want you to consider what you might do to do that with yourself, with your team, with your managers. Not all of you need or want more on this topic, and some organizations are really good at this and have this kind of wrapped up and are blowing and going, and this is part of their culture. And they have resources to address these. But if your organization isn't equipped for these activities and you'd still like to implement some of these or bring these types of ideas to your organization, then I invite you to consider working with me. If you're impatient to get started, then we can talk about how you can start. I have set aside some times you can schedule a call with me to explore working together further, and I can answer more questions, go into a little bit of this deeper. It's a complimentary call. I've reserved a limited number of slots and made these available for people who need more assistance implementing one or more of these concepts. To get results you need this year, get started now before the end of the year, and get going, be prepared for 2021. On this call, I'll walk you through a process to identify some of your current risk assessment capabilities. We'll look at what you're doing now, what we might do, and we can decide collaboratively how to work together to help you get some tools and techniques into your organization to start doing more risk-based thinking and risk-based decision-making. I take this time to work with people personally and companies personally, because working together requires mutual investment, trust, and I want both of us to be confident that Purple Link is the right fit for you and your organization. It's simple to get this call. Just go to callwithjane.com, pick your time zone, select a meeting, and we'll be in touch. It's a great option for you if you're not sure of the first steps of how to actually begin applying some of this to your decision making, and especially those of you who are now looking at getting ready for 2021. If you're thinking, that sounds good, I'll do that later, I'm going to give you some incentive to do it right now. Before you go back to the piles of work on your desk, before you go back to the crisis of the day, and before you go back to that next problem that's going to overtake you for the rest of the day and on into next week, before you get engrossed in a lot of the other things you're doing, and before you lose my contact information. So if there's not any questions about this call, I'm going to say do it now. If you schedule this call by the end of today, you're going to get the slides from this presentation. You're going to get a 1-month subscription to my dynamic dialogue webinars, which are weekly. They're valued at $145 for the subscription weekly, and you get the slides, you get the talk, you get all of that, and you get access to a library too, where I have a lot of other previously done talks. So the slides from this presentation, the dynamic dialogue, it's great value, and it's always great to get free stuff. So to get that, all you have to do is callwithjane.com and schedule the call. So schedule that by the end of today. So that's what I have, and I'm going to do some prizes, and then I will take questions. So right now, if you haven't already done so, I want you to send me an email with the word webinar as the subject. If you do that, you're going to get more information about webinars, workshops, and if you'd like a follow-up call with me, maybe you don't want to go to call with Jane, you can just write follow-up in the subject along with the word webinar. So send me the word webinar in the email. I'll give you about 30 more seconds to do that, and then I'm going to award these prizes. So the winner is going to get the slides from today, which everyone who does a call also gets that. You're going to get the subscription to Dynamic Dialogue, and you're going to get a great book, Measure What Matters. This is a really interesting book by John Doerr. He was a venture capitalist working with Google and some of those organizations. It's recommended by Bill Gates, and he talks about, instead of KPIs, he talks about objectives and key results. He talks about OKRs. It's a great thing to put into your library, and there's a lot of good ideas in there. So if everyone's done that, I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds to do the email. I've got a lot of emails here, which is great. And I'm going to use my magic random number generator here. I'm going to count how many people I have. And I'm going to pick, and the winner is going to be Lydia Rosen. So Lydia, if you're there, you can maybe go into the chat and just confirm that you're still here, because that was one of the requirements, is that you have to be present. And also, Lydia, what I need you to do to claim the prize is to send me a mailing address so I can mail you the book. Good, congratulations. So I appreciate that. And now I'm going to open it back up to questions. I'm going to stop the recording.